Good evening, everyone. I really thank you, hardy souls, for coming out. Obviously, it's a very sad day in New York and Brooklyn, and we feel badly for the people that were impacted by the incidents in the subway station and for everybody in New York. But thank you for coming. My name is Billy Weitzer. I'm the Executive Director of the Leo Baeck Institute, and I welcome you on behalf of the Leo Baeck Institute and the Center for Jewish History. It was 2 years ago in a month, plus 1 month, that we opened our previous exhibit on Washington Heights. Everyone on the planet knows what's happened since then. So while we don't know what the pandemic will bring in the future, we're thrilled that we're back to having a live exhibit opening. I think everyone here also knows something about Theresienstadt. However, our perceptions are skewed by the stories of how the camp was set up as a model to demonstrate the conditions were not that bad in the camps. This exhibit examines the real Theresienstadt from multiple dimensions that collectively reveal the reality of the dire circumstances within the camp and the deadly consequences of being transported to Auschwitz and almost certain death. I hope you had a chance to look through it tonight and that you'll come back and bring others. The exhibit will be open until the end of November, so there is plenty of time. I want to thank many people who were involved in putting the exhibit together. Magda Robel, our Associate Director of Public History, also Lauren Paustian, Michael Simonson, Renata Evers, among other LBI staff. We were aided by Christine Schmidt of the Wiener Library, who was a reader and editor of our material, and by staff from the Center for Jewish History. To get directly to our program, we are honored that Zuzana Justman is joining us. She is a survivor of Theresienstadt, a documentary filmmaker whose work have largely been filmed in the Czech Republic and other European countries. In her work, she explores the Holocaust as well as post-war history. Her films include A Trial in Prague, Voices of the Children, which won an Emmy Award in 1999, Czech Women, Now We Are Free, and Terezín Diary. She's also a playwright. Her most recent script, Waiting for Father, premiered at staged reading at the Czech Center in New York in 2018. She's going to be in conversation with Michael Simonson, our head of public outreach at the Leo Baeck Institute, who staffs the Dr. Robert Ira Louie Reference Service, in which capacity he helps thousands of scholars each year and independent researchers, museum and archive colleagues access our collections. In that way, he's contributed his deep knowledge of LBI collections to countless scholarly books, family trees, museum exhibitions, documentary films, and other projects. The two of them are going to be in conversation, and then there'll be opportunity to ask some questions and still more opportunity to have some food and wine afterwards. So welcome.
I wanted to welcome everyone, and I wanted to welcome Zuzana Justman to be with us. I'll give a little brief introduction as well, though not as much directly about Zuzana, as a little bit about Theresienstadt ghetto, but it's just a brief introduction so you know more about what we're going to talk about tonight. And I'm going to refer to Theresienstadt by its Czech name, Terezín. That's the name Zuzana knows it as. Approximately 140,000 Jews went through Terezín. Of them, nearly 90,000 were deported to points further east and almost certain death, mostly at Auschwitz, but also at Treblinka and other places. Roughly 33,000, most but not all elderly, died in Theresienstadt itself. Among those deported to the ghetto were 15,000 children, 90% of whom were sent onward and murdered in the killing centers. Our guest tonight, a child at the time, is one of those 10% who was able or had the luck to evade that fate. Today we have many ideas of Terezín, ideas that I, at least, am inclined to call or almost call misconceptions. Among them is the idea that Terezín served as a model ghetto, a paradise ghetto, as a ghetto for the elderly. These are actually identities given it in certain phases by the Nazi rulers themselves for propaganda purposes. It also is often described as a cultural ghetto for artists and performers. Again, something the Nazis used for their own propaganda devices. On the other side, some compare Terezín as a place similar to the ghettos in Eastern Europe, such as in Warsaw and Lodz. These are also inaccurate comparisons, I believe, for many reasons. Finally, there's also the idea the prisoners automatically formed a kind of supportive community for one another based on a shared identity as Jews. And in truth, modern scholarship, I think, shows the ghetto population was actually sharply divided along lines of national identity and language. So tonight, in my conversation with Zuzana, I wanted to talk a little bit about these misconceptions, talk a little more in line with our exhibit about the reality of Terezín and existence there. And I hope in our conversation we can clarify and illuminate the reality behind some of the myths that have developed around Terezín. And after our discussion, we'll talk maybe 20 minutes or so. Zuzana will answer some questions from the audience. And otherwise, I have other questions I can continue asking and bothering Zuzana with. So I'd like to welcome you, Zuzana.
Thank you.
And I think the first thing I wanted to bring up in my series of topics here is the fact that Terezín is often remembered as a model ghetto for special prisoners, World War I Iron Cross holders, artists, important cultural figures, etc. How true is this version of Terezín?
Well, as Michael said, the idea that Terezín was a model ghetto, a town where Jews could lead a peaceful, safe existence, was a myth created by the Nazis for propaganda purposes. But in many ways, this myth worked. And when the Red Cross Commission visited Terezín in June 1944, most members of the delegation were deceived. Perhaps not all of them. It is now, there's some research has been done, and it's possible that the Danish delegate had a chance to speak to one of the Danes, and he was not fooled. But even some Jews were taken in by this myth. There's a story told that a transport arrived from Berlin of elderly Jews who were wearing fur coats and expected luxurious accommodations. Sadly, this myth has survived until today. And some well-meaning people, many well-meaning people who don't quite know their history, still believe that Terezín was a model ghetto. And I'm very disturbed frequently when I see this description in greatly respected publications. Historians debate whether Terezín was a ghetto or a concentration camp. And for me, it was a prison. And the only way out was a train to Auschwitz. As Michael had said, in reality, Terezín was a place of terrible overcrowding, hunger, and disease, and many people died. I think he gave you the numbers of how many people died. And the worst part was probably the fear of being transported east. The transports were continual. For me, one reason why Terezín is difficult to describe briefly is because in its existence from 1941 to 1945, it went through many changes. You mentioned the myth of it being an old people's ghetto. For a period, I think the Nazis intended it to be that, but that was only for a part of its existence. But another reason why it's difficult to describe Terezín is that it was different for different groups. And the group that suffered the most were the old. My grandmother, Caroline, she was a gentle, beautiful old lady with lovely long white hair. She was housed in this not large room with about 30 women her age, all sleeping on triple-decker bunk beds, most of them sick and starving. Miraculously, my grandmother survived. In contrast, there was a smaller group of young people, mostly young men, but also young women who worked in the food distribution, in kitchens, in the bakery, and in agriculture. And they had access to food. I'm not saying that they were given more food, but they helped themselves to it. What they did was a practice called Schleusen, which was a commonly used word in Terezín, based on Schleuse, the sluice, the place where we had to pass through when we arrived, and the German women who were in charge stole a lot of our belongings. So Schleusen was not frowned upon, but stealing from one's neighbor was still not morally acceptable. So perhaps that is what I can say about Terezín as a model ghetto, but if you have some questions about that.
Well, yeah, I mean, I know there's this idea, I think, as well, that people were chosen specifically to go there. If you were more artistic or you had served in World War I. And was there any truth in this, would you say, Zuzana?
Well, I can talk about the arts, and part of that is the misconception that Terezín was a destination for people in the arts. And that is completely wrong, at least as regards Czech Jews. It's true that many creative people were brought there, but they were simply part of the Czech Jewish population. Nearly all Czech Jews passed through Terezín, and so people in the arts were among them. It is as if all the Jews from New York City were sent to a camp. There certainly would be many writers, musicians, and theater people and artists among them. So it was not a destination for these people. They just happened to be part of the whole population.
Mm-hmm.
But can I talk a little more about the arts in Terezín?
Sure, go ahead. That's leading into the next questions anyway, I would have. So please.
Yeah.
No, you go ahead.
All right.
Just Terezín, I can say it actually. Terezín is often remembered as a ghetto where the prisoners experienced art and culture, which in turn allowed them, in a sense, to keep their humanity. How true was this? And do you remember any concerts or cultural experiences you attended which moved you?
Well, it's certainly true that there was this extraordinary cultural activity. The prisoners held concerts, operas, plays, cabarets. Composers composed works that are performed today, and artists secretly painted pictures that were hidden and now are exhibited all over the world. But I think it's wrong to assume that all the prisoners had access to this cultural life. Today, people who write or make films about culture in Terezín, they base their research mostly on testimonies with people, with prisoners who were involved with the arts. And they talk about how wonderful it was and how it made their lives so much easier and how they were able to create. But they were not representative of the Terezín general population. There were the number of people in Terezín varied, but at times there were 60,000 people there. So I would say that only a small percentage of 60,000 people were able to enjoy the arts. And some of the prisoners had no idea this cultural life was going on. If I think, for instance, my parents, who, certainly were very involved in this way of life when they were before the war, they had difficult jobs. My mother had to scrub floors. They both worked and they had to do physical work that they were totally not used to. And they came home completely exhausted. And so that was another reason. I mean, these performances were held in such tiny spaces, prisoners' rooms, parts of the attic, basements. They certainly couldn't accommodate too many people. So to think that most of the prisoners could benefit from this, I think is wrong. About my own experiences, well, one of the most popular cultural events was the children's opera Brindji Bar. And it was performed in Terezín 55 times. And it was nearly impossible to get a ticket for it. And I was very lucky because my best friend, her name was Zuzana Barter. She's survived, but is no longer with us, played the role of the dog. So I was able to be backstage every night that she sang. And I sang in the choir 3 times. I was not a particularly good singer, but I sang 3 times in the choir. So in addition to Brindji Bar, I was also able to attend some operas because my friend Zuzana was the daughter of an opera singer by the name of Ada Schwarz-Klein. She was a star at the German Opera in Prague. And whenever she performed, I could go. And she had the leading role in Carmen. And I remember that I saw Carmen in Terezín. And I should also mention that if there are any Czech speakers in the audience, my friend Zuzana did not originate the part of the dog. The original singer was Zdeněk Ornest, and he was the younger brother of a great Czech poet called Jiří Orten. Their name was Ornstein, but they changed their names differently. Zdeněk Ornest went to Auschwitz, but he survived and became a successful actor in Prague.
Mm-hmm. I was going to ask too, if you were ever part of any activity, or was your life affected at all, or your family's life, by the Nazi attempts for the beautification of the ghetto?
No, I didn't have any part in that. I don't remember it. I do remember that there was an area where toward the end, well, after October 1944, when 11 transports left for Auschwitz and most of the men left Terezín, 2/3 of the population left. And there were hardly any men, and women had to take over the men's jobs, and children were required to work. And I had a job as a dental assistant. And but afterward, we all, my friends and I, met behind this barracks. I think it was the Dresden barracks, but I'm not sure. And we played a game that was very popular in Prague before we went to Terezín, and then in Terezín, it was a form of dodgeball, but we call it Völkerball. And all Terezín children played Völkerball. maybe most of them. And in Czech, it's called Vybiena. And but we called it Felkeba or Felkets. And so in the area where we played this game, during the beautification, they built a children's pavilion, but it was locked and it was never unlocked. Maybe when the Red Cross visit came, they unlocked it, but I never saw it unlocked. That's the only experience I had.
Mhm. I wanted to also ask about the different nationalities in Terezín, and if there was a lot of interaction between them, like did Czechs and Germans intermingle, the Danes, the Dutch, there were a few other people there as well.
Well, there were only 500 Danes, and I didn't know any. Oh, I did know my brother was in the hospital all the time. First he had polio, and then he had tuberculosis. When he was in the tuberculosis hospital, there was a Dane there. And I had this book with some international foreign language expressions, naughty expressions. And I used to shout it at this poor Dane who was in the room with my brother. But I did not know any other Danes. And the children, the Czech children didn't really interact with the German-speaking children. You know, I had to speak German in my job. German was the official language of the camp, and when I worked as a dental assistant, one of my jobs was to call patients in and speak to them in German. But other than that, I'm afraid I don't have any information on this topic.
Yeah, well, I think that says a lot itself, that you didn't really know any of the German children or German prison. That in itself says a lot. I wanted to talk a little bit as well about the SS. I think there's an idea, a common idea, of course, that that the SS, like in all the ghettos, had a very active presence committing atrocities and crimes among the ghetto population daily. And in truth, my understanding is the SS were rarely in Theresienstadt, that it was more run by the prisoners themselves.
That is completely correct. We hardly ever saw any SS, but I had one very scary experience. Almost everybody in Terezín lived in different places. They moved us around. And when we first arrived, my mother and I were in an attic area with a lot of, with about 30 or 40 women and children. And we were assigned 2 beds, and they were next to each other. And then after a few days, they told us we should put them at an angle. And that was the area between the beds was our private area. And this attic there was no running water or heat. But we were able to move from there after about 9 months or a year to a room where we lived with another family. There were 8 of us. We had bunk beds, double bunk beds. And after October 44, when Terezín was really emptied, we were able to get a room just for our family. That was my mother, her sister, my cousin who was my age, and my grandmother. And my grandmother was able to live with us. One reason she survived was that we were able to give her some food, you know, if we had any extra food, because the old people really could hardly live on what they received. Most people could, you know, most people in Terezín were hungry all the time. Everybody tried to get something extra, but it was often impossible. But we were told, we arrived in Terezín only in 1943. we were asked to appear. We were summoned a year earlier, but I got scarlet fever, and both the Germans and the Prague Jewish community were afraid of infection. So we were exempted from that transport and managed to stay in Prague for another year, which probably saved our lives because there were many transports went to Auschwitz at that time from Terezín. Why am I telling you this? Anyway.
About the SS. And it started
Okay,
in
yes.
talking about an
So
SS.
we lived with my grandmother, yes. And but she arrived in Terezín before any of us did. And she was called into a transport, and she was already waiting for the train. And a friend of the family saw her and led her to a shack and locked her in there for 3 days. And the transport left, and he let her out, and she went back to her room, and nobody noticed. But that was in 1942. It's later on, it couldn't have happened because they were much better organized. So anyway, we had this nice room with a window for the 5 of us, and there was a stove, and we needed coal. So my cousin Peter, who was my age, and I went to this place on the edge of the ghetto to steal some coal, and we carried it in one of the pieces of luggage that we arrived to Terezín with, each walking side by side, each carrying one handle. And we were walking, and toward us walked an SS man. And I panicked, and I said to Peter, let's run. He said, no, don't, just calm down, walk slowly. And we managed to pass by him and nothing happened. But that was my only experience with an SS.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that was very rare.
Mm-hmm. I guess before we open up to questions, I guess one thing I did want to ask is I think there's a lot of confusion about how the children lived in the ghetto in Terezín, because there were these children's homes, but not all children lived in the children's homes. I wondered if you could.
Only about half. Half. I did not. And it was only when I started making films and interviewing a lot of people that I realized that they had better food than we did. Because my food was the same as my parents. We were told to bring these Essschuss, that was a German word for metal containers for the food, because when you went to pick up your food, you had to have a container to put it in. And people made these wooden carriers where you could put 3 of these Essschuss. And so I used to go and pick up the food for the whole family, and the 3 of us, because my brother was in the hospital. And we all got the same thing. I mean, that's another myth, I think, that children had much better food than the others. What I did get was 1 glass of milk a week, but we got exactly the same amount of bread. And when I went to pick up the lunch, it was always the same as my parents. So I think the children who lived in the homes were very crowded, and most of the Betreuerinnen, those who took care of them, were quite wonderful. And there was Friedelicke Brandeis, the Bauhaus artist, who was in charge of their drawing pictures, that so many of them survived. And they had classes, and I attended the classes for a very short period of time. I had English and Judaism, that's all I remember. But my English was very limited. And so the children's lives, I think the ones who lived in the homes were slightly better than those that lived in attics like I did.
Mm-hmm.
And
Um,
there's another thing about children. Oh, you
go
said
ahead though. You can say.
that about 1/10 survived, because it's mistakenly repeated that only 100 children survive, and that is a wrong number. It's closer to 1,000, between 1,000 and 1,500.
Ah,
Still,
okay.
still terrible, but
Mhm.
it's not.
Yeah.
The 100 is wrong.
Mhm. Yeah. Okay, I think now we could open it up to some questions if there's any questions from people in the audience, David. Also, if people are watching from home, you can write your questions in the question and answer box and I can answer them. Otherwise, if there are no questions, I'll continue. I can keep talking.
Well, can you guys hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay,
I'll
yeah,
repeat
so,
the question if I can.
Yeah, if anyone from the audience has a question, please raise your hand and I'll sort of translate through the microphone, since I'm not sure the microphone will reach that far. So we have one in the back.
Okay.
I can't hear.
Yeah, no, he'll repeat it.
Oh.
Thanks. So I'll just repeat the question very briefly. The first is, could you tell us how old you were when you were in the ghetto? And the second is about how you coped with the experience and any trauma you might feel that you suffered as a result of it. I guess, afterwards.
Well, I had just turned 12. For a long time, I thought I was 11. Our memories are not reliable. And when I found my diary, which I couldn't find for a long time, I realized that I just turned 12 because we went there in July of 1943. And I was almost 14 when the war was over, but not quite. And how did I deal with the trauma? That is a very large question, very large question. And, I'm afraid maybe I can say one thing is that, when someone nowadays, when someone suffers trauma, they usually get help. It is suggested that they have therapy or a support group. But in 1945, when the war was over, and we all waited for the war to be over and to be liberated, we used to say, "Až bude konec," when the end comes. We talked about that every day, what we'll do and what we'll eat. And then when the end came, it was nothing like what we hoped, because we realized that we wouldn't be reunited with the people who went to Auschwitz. And so the end was difficult for most of us. And because all these people who survived the camps were brought back to Terezín on trains, or they walked. That was a terrible time. So anyway, in 1945, when I returned to Prague finally, there was no talk about therapy or help. We were kind of told to move on. We had to take tests to be able to go to school in our grade, and we tried to study for the test because we didn't go to school for 5 years. And I went to a very good girls' high school in Prague. And I don't know if anybody ever asked me about Terezín or anything like that. So that was the beginning. And also, when I arrived in Buenos Aires in 1948, my mother's relatives, her 4 brothers, were in South America, and they were very kind to us, but they asked us not to talk about the past. My grandmother also came with us. She survived because one reason was because she wanted to see her 4 sons again, and they asked her not to talk about it either. So that's what comes to mind right now.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you for sharing that. I'll take a question from online. So we have people viewing on YouTube, and one of them, named Katie Haber, asks if you knew her uncle Franta Zelenka, who was the director of Brundy Bar.
Well, he was famous, yes. Well, he was an architect and a theater designer, and he was very active in the theater of Burian in Prague. I knew of him, but I don't remember meeting him.
And then there's a second part of the question. Do you remember the propaganda film that was directed by Kurt Geron? Did you have knowledge?
I don't remember when it was. I don't remember it being filmed, but I can tell you that that's another misconception. It is not called Hitler Gives the Jews a City. It's called Ghetto Theresienstadt. There's a good article by Karel Margry, which I imagine, Michael, you're familiar with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Is there another question from the live audience? Yeah.
Oh, and may I just add that film, it's all propaganda, but it was a little bit useful for me in making my films because there's no visual evidence of Terezín and Auschwitz, and except the propaganda film. So I use parts of it, but filmmakers have to be very careful to always make sure that the audience knows it's a propaganda film and not a documentary.
Yeah, before you go on, David, with your question, we had, that's one reason there's really no photographs in our exhibit on Terezín, because it's all propaganda. And so we didn't really want to use that as examples of what it looked like, etc.
Alfred Cantor, are you using his drawings in the exhibit?
No, I mean, we don't have his stuff in our archive, so we really just used our own collections.
Yeah, I've always used that in my films.
Yeah,
it's the book of Alfred Cantor, a wonderful book and a wonderful artist who really documented not just Terezín, but Auschwitz and I think Schwarzheide, the other camp he was in.
Mm. Yeah.
Okay, your question?
This is the first time I've heard Theresienstadt referred to as a ghetto. It's always been a camp. I'm trying to digest that it was a ghetto.
Mm-hmm. So the question is that the audience member says that this is the first time they've heard Theresienstadt referred to as a camp and a ghetto. I'm sorry, as a ghetto, and so they're digesting the fact that we're referring to it here as a ghetto frequently. So maybe you can talk about that distinction again. I know that you, I think you opened up with a little bit of discussion of that, but maybe you could talk in a little more detail about what the distinctions are.
Well, as I said, historians debate this question, this definition, and I call it a prison. But I think this is a question for historians, and I'm here to mostly speak about my own experience, and I don't feel qualified to answer that.
And it's addressed a little bit in the exhibit too. I mean, some of the distinctions are that So Theresienstadt was a town before it became a place of confinement. And you know, the prisoners didn't work. Right. But anyway, there's a little bit of discussion of that in the exhibit that you could look up. And then of course the books there on Heikova's New History of Theresienstadt is called The Last Ghetto. And there's some other discussion of it. But
I can say
it's an important question.
I can say for myself, but this is just me, and I actually can definitely see it both ways. I think, Zuzana, you're right. It's a prison more than anything else. But I guess I always think of it as a ghetto or as a transit camp, because really, when I think of a camp, I think of a destination where the people are in the Holocaust, a destination where people are not supposed to leave. You know, they go there, they never come back, they don't come out. Terezín was a place where everyone's collected, but then they're all sent out. I mean, that was the Nazi goal. And so I think because of that, I think of Terezín as a ghetto or as in as a transit camp. Of course, many people, of course, did die in Terezín, especially the elderly, but and others too. But people weren't sent there, I would say, to die. And so for me, that's the difference. But I mean, that's only me. And there's many people who would have a very different opinion from me about what to call it.
So there's another question from online about Jewish religious services. Do you remember attending any Jewish religious services or being aware of religious life in Theresienstadt, Zuzana?
No, my family was very assimilated, and I did not attend services before Terezín. And but there, in my film Voice of the Children, maybe about 30 years ago, they discovered a little hidden room where they worshipped during the ghetto's existence.
Yeah, and that small room was actually a part of our shared history project, which you can, there's a photograph of it in an essay by the Terezín. You could look up online. So here's another
Maybe
question.
it was about 40 years ago that they discovered it.
From the audience, one more question.
My great grandfather was murdered in Theresienstadt, and I know he died here. Even though the concentration camp was in gas, so we covered some kind of topics that we don't know about. We'll say,
Many.
I didn't hear.
He'll say it.
Oh.
I'm sorry. There's just a comment about the ghetto versus camp distinction, and the audience member notes that you said uncle, your great grandfather, was murdered in Theresienstadt, and that the Stolperstein for him it says, you know, I presume murdered Theresienstadt. Right. It's right. Yeah.
How it? Yeah. That's.
Someone was murdered in Terezín. Well, there were executions, and also toward the end of the war, there were all these rumors. They were building something that could have been used as a gas chamber, but I think the SS were divided about what to do with the population.
I think the larger point is that the conditions there caused people's deaths. Like it was because of the deprivation and the lack of.
That's certainly true. I mean, 1/4 of the population died there. Yeah.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, I think also like the term murdered, which is used on Stolperstein a lot correctly. I would agree with that term. But I mean, this is also a term that's used to describe the situation of the people, again, largely, but not always the elderly, who who died there of I suppose mostly disease brought on by malnutrition. So.
And not everyone, the people who survived, not everyone recovered their health.
Yeah.
My brother's health was broken. He was a writer and he was very productive, but he was an invalid.
So, oh, there's one more question here from the audience.
Yeah, so how was it determined who would be buried in the cemetery versus did they have ovens there? Because some of the ghettos had ovens to burn the bodies of the deceased. Do you know anything about how that decision?
There's a question about the cemetery in Theresienstadt and the interment of remains, whether people were generally cremated or if they were buried, where and why was the decision made to do one versus the other?
As far as I know, they were cremated. But perhaps there were some burials as well. I think there were some burials as well. Yeah. Both.
Yeah, I don't know much about that. I know I've ordered before records from Theresienstadt for researchers, death records. And they generally come as a report on the cremation of the body. That's the most I could say about that.
My brother has a story about, it's part of his book about a burial. And my brother was 6 years older than me. So I take that as a fact.
I could ask a question, Zuzana. Could you talk a little bit about liberation from the camp and what that experience was like, and how long you stayed there, what conditions were like after liberation? So I understand there was actually a terrible typhus epidemic that took over.
There was a terrible typhus
after liberation. So if you could just talk a little bit about that, how you experienced that.
Well, as I said, it was, we were all waiting for it and wishing for it. And then it was nothing like what we hoped, because that's when we learned, that's when I learned that my father was not coming back from Auschwitz. And there were all these people were brought back to Terezín, and there was a typhoid epidemic. So we were quarantined and we couldn't leave for, I think, about 3 weeks. For me personally, it was difficult because I learned that my father was dead. But two of my cousins, first cousins, who went through Auschwitz and other camps, returned. And that was an incredible moment because they were liberated in January by the American army, and they went through Auschwitz and other camps. They were liberated in January, and one of them spoke English, and the Americans gave them a jeep, and they followed the American army toward Czechoslovakia. And by the time they came to Terezín in May, they looked wonderful. They were suntanned because the jeep was open, and they had put on weight. And it was, whenever anyone survived, the news spread through Terezín like wildfire. And the SS had a swimming pool, and after liberation, the pool was open for Terezín children for 1 day. And I didn't have a bathing suit, but my aunt was working in this place where they had all kinds of clothing, and she brought me a bathing suit. And I was sitting there with my friends, and all of a sudden somebody said, the Meissner boys are back. Those were my cousins. And I threw on my shorts and I started running. And on the main street toward me was my mother leading these two boys by the arm and screaming in this inhuman voice, "The Meissner boys are back." So that was a wonderful moment when somebody survived, everybody celebrated. But other than that, it was mostly sad. And so when my family was ready to go back to Prague, when the quarantine was over, my cousins somehow provided a truck or a big car. But I didn't go to Prague with them because I was always dying to go to summer camp. And we had an opportunity to sign up for a Quaker camp in a Czech castle. And I did that. And my family left and I was supposed to go to this castle a little later, but the trip was postponed by a week. So I was alone in Terezín with all these Russian soldiers roaming around. And it was a little bit scary because they had the reputation of raping women. So I mostly stayed in this room where our last residence, and just sneaked out for food. And finally, after a week, I left Terezín.
Thank you.
Maybe we could do one more question, and I think a good closing question has come in from online. From Lisa Peschel, who I assume is the same Lisa Peschel who writes about theater and cabaret.
Yes, she's a wonderful writer.
Yeah, and she
knows everything about theater and cabaret.
Yeah. And actually, I think we agreed to co-promote this. She worked with a theater maker in New York named Edward Einhorn, and they're doing and sort of an evening of cabaret from Theresienstadt that she documents in her work, I think at the Triad Theater in May. So something you might want to look up. But anyway, Lisa asks if you could talk a little bit about your own films. Of course, you've been talking about your, early experiences, but of course you've had a whole career since then.
Well, thank you, Lisa. The film that has to do with Terezín that I like better than Terezín Diaries, Voices of the Children, because I was not completely happy with my first film, Terezín Diary, although it does have some valuable interviews. For instance, this Zdeněk Ornest, who was the boy who sang the role of the dog in Brundibar and then became a well-known actor. But for the Voices of the Children, I wanted to portray a smaller number of people and examine them in greater depth than I did my first film. And the three people that are in Voices of the Children are Helga Hošková, who is known for her drawings, and Helga Kinski, who was also very talented paint artist when she was in Terezín, and has a wonderful diary that came out in German. And Michael Kraus, an architect who lived in Brookline. And I tell their stories of going to Terezín at the age of 12, then going to Auschwitz and other camps, and I follow them and tell the story of their lives after the war and their relationship with their children and the effect of the war on their families. I chose these three people because they all kept diaries, wonderful detailed diaries, and they all drew pictures. And that's Voices of the Children.
Well, thank you so much, Zuzana, for spending this time with us and sharing your experience with us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah. And thank you all for coming.